On Easter Sunday, 2026, the whole of Windsor Castle held its breath as every camera in Britain locked onto the exact same spot. What followed was a single photograph that would send shockwaves through the palace. A quiet devastation that nobody in Camilla's inner circle saw coming. Prince William walked into St. George's Chapel with Princess Catherine right beside him. Their three children flanked them like an impenetrable wall. After years of devastating illness, prolonged absence, and vicious whispers that the Wales family was quietly falling apart, they were back. They were together, locked in, and visibly unbreakable. The crowd simply could not look away. Right beside William stood Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh. His son James was right there with him. Princess Anne was close, and Peter Phillips was standing nearby. Every single one of them was arranged around William and Catherine like a fortress, operating exactly like a family that already knew something the rest of the world did not. Now look closely at that formation and look for Camilla. The people closest to Camilla's world were nowhere near that inner circle. Prince Andrew, the disgraced brother, she had never publicly cut off despite everything the world knew about him, was completely absent. His daughters Beatrice and Eugenie did not come either. The family members who had always orbited her side of the royal picture were entirely erased from the frame. And the people who were there, William, Catherine, Edward, Anne, all of them had pulled tightly into one unified formation on the completely opposite side of that chapel. Nothing about that photograph was accidental. At an event of this magnitude at Windsor, with the entire global monarchy watching, every single physical placement is decided weeks in advance. Every position is a deliberate institutional statement. Someone decided who stood exactly where. And someone decided that Camilla's people would not stand anywhere near the future king. That photograph was not just a picture. It was a visual verdict. It was the undeniable proof that she was out, that the institutional walls had finally closed in on her, and that the people now shaping the future of the monarchy had looked at her empire and quietly decided she would not be part of it. What Camilla just realized behind closed doors is that her 3-decade campaign for absolute dominance was nothing more than a staggering illusion of power. This is the story of a secret institutional power grabbed the silent weaponization of administrative protocol, and the devastating realization that Queen Camilla actually owns absolutely nothing. To understand how completely the trap has snapped shut around her, we have to rebuild the illusion of absolute power she constructed for herself. For 30 years, she manipulated the narrative, working systematically to erase Diana's legacy and elevate her own non-royal children. She operated under the absolute belief that she had Charles completely controlled, and, by extension, that she had the monarchy controlled. She felt utterly untouchable, and she began to broadcast that arrogance through the most sacred symbols of the institution. In February 2023, during a visit to Brick Lane in East London, Camilla walked out into the public wearing a piece of jewelry that made senior royal insiders go completely still. It was a brooch crafted in the shape of the Tudor crown. A silver frame, sapphires, rubies, and emeralds pressed into it like a declaration of absolute dominance. This detail matters deeply. The Tudor crown is the central symbol on King Charles III's official royal cipher. It is the very emblem of his authority as sovereign. It is his identity pressed into metal and precious stone, and Camilla fastened it directly over her heart and walked out in front of the world. Royal jewelry experts are entirely unambiguous about what brooches mean in palace life. They are never mere accessories. They are positioned near the heart deliberately to carry messages about loyalty, authority, and power that no official speech ever could. This specific brooch carried a message so loud it required no words at all. It was Camilla saying that she was not just standing beside the king, but that she carried his crown, that she was permanent, and that she was never going anywhere. Senior palace aides were completely blindsided by how brazen the display was. That brooch was not Camilla honoring the monarchy. It was Camilla telling the monarchy exactly where she intended to stay. But that was not even the moment that made people's blood run cold. When Charles was crowned in May 2023, Camilla walked into that sacred ceremony wearing jewels pulled directly from Queen Elizabeth II's most personal and private collection. The crown on her head had been aggressively reset with the Cullinan 3, 4, and 5 diamonds. These were the exact stones Queen Elizabeth had worn as a personal brooch for decades, affectionately calling them Granny's chips. These were not ceremonial display pieces belonging to the state. They were Elizabeth's own treasured belongings, pieces the entire country had watched rest on her shoulder for 70 years. The grief over Elizabeth's passing was still completely raw. The country had not even finished mourning her properly. Royal watchers described the moment Camilla appeared in those diamonds as a psychological gut punch. The palace public relations machine frantically called it a tribute to history. But the British public watched a woman who had spent 30 years being deeply despised reach directly into a dead queen's jewelry box on the very day she claimed her crown. Something inside millions of people went ice cold in that exact moment. Camilla was not just wearing stolen jewels. She was wearing the armor of a woman the country was still deeply grieving. A woman who had spent decades serving as the quiet, dignified opposite of everything Camilla's staggering exploitation represented. The public never forgot who Camilla was before any of this. They never forgot Diana. They remembered the woman who shattered one of the most beloved marriages in royal history. The wound she inflicted never healed, and every time Camilla reached for something that felt like it belonged to someone else, that wound cracked open and bled again. Prince Harry stated it with devastating clarity in his own memoir. He explicitly called Camilla dangerous. He detailed how she fed stories to the tabloids and built her own PR image on the sheer wreckage of the people around her. He labeled her the villain who required a redemption campaign built entirely on the suffering of others. By early 2026, the numbers confirmed everything Harry had warned about. Camilla's public approval had collapsed to a dismal 42%, while the number of people who actively despised her had climbed aggressively. Now, place that commercial desperation beside Prince Edward, a man 15th in line to the throne, a man so quietly devoted to his duty for 3 decades that most people forgot he even existed. While Camilla's approval plummeted, Edward's approval sat comfortably above 50%, with barely anyone viewing him negatively. A man nobody watched for 30 years was suddenly carrying more moral authority than the woman wearing the crown. Inside a monarchy where public approval is not just about image, but represents actual institutional leverage, that massive gap shifted the entire power dynamic. It quietly changed who held influence and who was being silently frozen out of the room. Camilla felt the temperature drop, but she did not yet understand how completely the system was about to swallow her. The trigger that set the institutional retaliation into motion involved Prince Andrew. Andrew was not just pushed aside in recent years, he was systematically dismantled piece by piece. He was forced out of Royal Lodge, the grand mansion he had occupied for decades, and relocated to Wood Farm, a deeply isolated property on the Sandringham estate. Then King Charles formally stripped Andrew of his remaining titles. The message was brutal and entirely clean. There was no road back for him. But this exact situation impacted Prince Edward in a deeply personal way that nobody discussed publicly. For years, Edward and his wife Sophie had maintained a quiet, private tradition of spending their Easter holidays at Wood Farm. It was not a public engagement. It was their personal family sanctuary. Andrew's forced relocation to that specific property made their continued presence there impossible. Their sanctuary was ruined, and the visit was permanently cancelled. In a life built strictly on uncomplaining routine and unyielding loyalty, that rupture landed far harder than anyone on the outside realized. What Edward did next revealed the terrifying forensic discipline of a man protecting the crown. Reports confirmed that Edward was the first senior royal to visit Andrew after a recent scandal escalation. And the detail that changes everything is that King Charles was merely 1 mile away at Sandringham when it happened. Charles did not go. Edward went instead. But Edward did not go to comfort Andrew or offer brotherly solidarity. He went to end it. He pushed Andrew firmly and ruthlessly to accelerate his departure, demanding he stop dragging the situation out and stop letting the PR damage spread any further. Edward walked into his own brother's crisis, delivered a cold institutional truth, and walked back out without flinching. When Charles's cancer diagnosis forced him to pull back from public duties, Edward and Sophie stepped forward instantly without ever being asked. They took on grueling solo international tours representing the king with no safety net beneath them. They carried the crushing weight of a monarchy that could not function without them. And then Charles released his April 2024 honors list. The list that was supposed to reflect exactly who had shown up and done the work. Queen Camilla was on it. Prince William was on it. Princess Catherine was on it. Edward and Sophie were completely erased. They were not mentioned once. The omission was so glaringly obvious that royal commentators flagged it loudly across the British press. Everyone noticed, but Edward and Sophie responded with total deafening silence. Not one word of complaint. Not one leaked story of frustration. They simply kept working at the exact same relentless pace. Inside the ruthless machinery of the palace, that kind of silence is not weakness. It is the most devastatingly calculated move available. While Edward and Sophie were being wiped off that honors list, Camilla's inner circle, the people palace insiders called the Rottweilers were being protected and rewarded. Her people remained entirely untouched. That was the administrative message. It clearly stated that Camilla's circle would always be placed above the actual blood family that carried the institution. Edward received that message perfectly. He understood exactly what it meant. And from that exact moment forward, his loyalty stopped being a blanket he threw over the entire institution. He weaponized it. He directed his loyalty at one single person, the one man he knew would recognize it and return it when the time came. That person was Prince William. Edward watched Camilla's team freeze his wife Sophie out for years. He watched Sophie endure ugly planted press stories while maintaining absolute dignity. Something inside Edward hardened permanently. He did not make a scene. He did something far more dangerous. He chose a side, and he made absolutely certain that William knew exactly which side he had chosen. By the time that Easter 2026 photograph was taken, the trap had already snapped shut. Camilla looked around the chapel and finally saw the horrifying reality of her situation. The people she had spent years marginalizing were the exact people standing in an unbreakable wall around the future king. She suddenly realized that the administrative protocol she thought she controlled was actually being used to meticulously dismantle her entire future. She was trapped, the power was gone, and the silent execution of her institutional erasure had officially begun. The moment the heavy wooden doors of St. George's Chapel closed behind them on that Easter Sunday, the temperature in the room fundamentally changed. Camilla had spent decades mastering the art of the whisper, the leaked tabloid story, the quiet backstage maneuver. But as she looked at the impenetrable wall of William, Catherine, Edward, and Anne, she realized she had been entirely outplayed in a game she thought she had invented. Naturally, in her moment of sudden isolation, she turned to the one person who had spent 30 years shielding her from consequence. She turned to King Charles. And that is where the story changes forever. Because Charles did absolutely nothing. When Camilla privately demanded that her inner circle be restored to their rightful places of prominence, when she insisted that the visual humiliation of the seating arrangements be corrected, Charles remained entirely silent. Whether it was the deep exhaustion of his ongoing illness, a sudden desire to avoid conflict with his heir, or the quiet, devastating acceptance that his era was rapidly ending. His refusal to intervene was the psychological climax of her entire royal existence. For 30 years, Charles had repeatedly torn the monarchy apart to elevate her. He had waged a relentless war against public opinion and his own family to place a crown on her head. Now, standing in the twilight of his reign, he was simply letting her fall. That silence was not just a lack of action. It was the ultimate emotional betrayal. It was the devastating realization that without Charles actively fighting her battles and forcing the institution to bow, she possessed no structural power whatsoever. This brings us to the staggering reality of her commercial desperation. To the outside world, Camilla is the queen. She lives in historic palaces, travels in armored motorcades, and wears priceless diamonds. But behind the velvet ropes of the institution, the financial architecture tells a brutally different story. Camilla owns virtually nothing of the royal empire. The vast wealth, the sprawling private estates, the multi-million-dollar agricultural revenues, all of it is heavily tied up in the Duchy of Cornwall. And the Duchy of Cornwall belongs entirely and exclusively to Prince William. He controls the properties, he controls the private funding, he controls the literal ground beneath their feet. When Charles is eventually gone, Camilla's lavish lifestyle, the extensive salaries of her inner circle, her private security details, they all become completely dependent on William's financial goodwill. The woman who spent 30 years trying to conquer the monarchy is quietly waking up to the fact that she is essentially a tenant in William's house. The forensic proof of this shifting power dynamic is already visible to those who know exactly where to look. What looked like a routine administrative update regarding Palace security last month was actually a total dismantling of her empire. Royal insiders noted that several of Camilla's key staff members suddenly lost their high-level security clearances for the private residential wings of Windsor Castle. Their royal passes were quietly downgraded overnight. They are now required to use secondary entrances and side door exits, navigating the palace like visiting commercial contractors rather than the trusted aides of a sovereign. That detail matters immensely. In the royal household, physical access is the ultimate currency. A revoked pass is never a clerical error. It is a locked door on your future. It is the institution using a simple payroll sheet and a security badge to tell you that your time is up. Meanwhile, as Camilla's access rapidly shrinks, the new order is steadily taking its rightful place. Princess Catherine has returned to the absolute center of the frame. She has done this not with the aggressive public relations campaigns that defined Camilla's rise, but with the quiet, uncomplaining sacrifice that defines true royal duty. And with Catherine's return, we are witnessing subtle but devastating protocol shifts that are entirely rewriting the narrative. Portraits of Princess Diana that had been quietly moved into dark storage rooms during the early Patriarchate. Sensitive days of Camilla's reign have recently been brought back out. They are now being placed in highly visible corridors, where foreign dignitaries and heads of state are officially received. Catherine herself has been seen wearing highly significant pieces from Diana's personal jewelry collection with renewed frequency. She wears them not as borrowed accessories, but as her rightful, undeniable inheritance. These are not coincidences. This is the institutional restoration of Diana's legacy, executed coldly and perfectly without a single raised voice. William and Catherine are completely overriding Camilla's desperate attempts at institutional erasure. Every time Catherine wears Diana's sapphire ring, and every time a portrait of Diana is hung on a freshly painted palace wall, it is a silent, lethal reminder to Camilla that she may wear the crown for now, but she will never own the history. The profound tragedy of Camilla's blind ambition is that she spent her entire life trying to conquer an ancient institution by wearing its stolen jewelry and manipulating its press coverage. She completely failed to understand that absolute power cannot be borrowed from a dying king. It must be earned through the kind of silent, unwavering endurance that William, Catherine, Edward, and Sophie have spent decades perfecting. The fortress has been built. The administrative trap has finally snapped shut. And as the British monarchy prepares to cross the threshold into its next era, Camilla is finally being forced to watch from the outside, stripped of her illusion of power and left with absolutely nothing but the consequences of her own choices. Thank you for watching. If you found this forensic look into the shifting power dynamics of the royal family insightful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below and let me know how you think Prince William will handle the monarchy's transition. And I will see you in the next analysis.